And we're back with another new episode of the Watchmen Companion Podcast presented by The Disorderly. Please head over to thedisorderly.com for the best in sports and entertainment. David St. Martin and Andrew Volpe just recently did a spoiler review of The Lighthouse with Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, so be sure to check that out after this. But let's get to the episode, entitled Martial Feats of Comanche Horsemanship. Another great one. Just a great one. This show is fantastic. There's always the chance, of course, that this ends up in the vein of Lost and all this fantastic world building and all these mysteries just end up being sort of cluttered and unsolved and ultimately unsatisfying. But I truly don't think it will. And hand up if I'm wrong, but I believe The Leftovers was a turning point for Lindelof and he will bring us home. You got to believe in Lindelof, we trust. So let's recap. We open with a German officer dictating a propaganda flyer for the colored troops of the Great War, World War I that is. The flyer is meant to create dissent, basically, among the American troops by claiming that black people are treated well in Germany and treated poorly in America, so why would a black soldier fight for the Americans when they can move to Germany and be treated as equals? Right? The flyer dropped out of a plane onto what turns out to be Will's dad, the little boy from the beginning of episode 1. That note that his father scribbled out right before he put him in that crate to be driven off during the Tulsa riots, saying, "Watch over this boy," that note was written on the back of one of those flyers. Now, shout out to Jim and Aaron from Bald Move. They actually noticed this upon the first episode viewing, so props to them. I missed it. We then see the final scene from episode 1 replayed, but from the perspective of the old man in the wheelchair, which is Will all grown up. By the way, the synth music in this show is amazing. Reminds me of It Follows, that horror movie. My buddy Nate texted me about Trent Reznor being brilliant, and you'd be hard-pressed to argue with that. He set the tone for basically the entire show universe with that score. Leftovers had a very similar thing. Actually, Lost did too, although I can't remember the specific theme of it. But Leftovers, the music really puts you in the mood for Leftovers. I feel like this is also this sort of all-encompassing score that puts you right inside the Watchmen universe. So I love it. But back to the plot. Angela doesn't report the discovery of the police chief's hanging body and instead takes the old man to her fake bakery to interrogate him. Now, that was only half the plan, as it turns out. The other half was tricking him, although it's hard to kind of call it a trick when he probably would have consented to it either way, but whatever. Tricking him into drinking out of a coffee mug so that she could have a sample of his DNA. That DNA was later used to figure out that he is, in fact, Angela's grandfather, a grandfather that she never really knew much about or didn't know she had, other than the fact that biologically, obviously, she has a grandfather. She didn't know he was alive or where he was or anything. Oh, and there's something about those pills that he takes, by the way. I don't know what exactly, but there's something there. They kept putting him in the forefront of the shots. Angela asked him about them. He says he helps with his memory. There's more to it than that, though. I'd be willing to bet that they play a bigger role down the road, but we'll see. Anyway, old man Will tells Angela that there's a vast and insidious conspiracy at play. He says that he hung the police chief from the tree all on his own, which is crazy because he's 105 years old. He says that he did it because the chief had skeletons in his closet. And he says that he can't tell her the full conspiracy all at once because her head would explode. He needs to give it to her in pieces. We then got another nod to the Watchmen comics with the newspaper stand operator talking politics with a newspaper delivery man. A young Asian girl picks up the copy of every newspaper, to which the operator asks, "Let me ask you, does she really read all these?" Now, we don't know which she he's referring to, or if it's even a character we've met yet, but the concept of reading every newspaper every day reminds me a lot of Ozymandias from the comics, watching every news broadcast at once with his giant wall of televisions. The headline story in the newspaper, by the way, "Global Squid Falls Baffle Scientist," which is weird because it's not a new thing, right? These squid showers have been going on for, conceivably since the 80s when that giant squid came to Manhattan, although maybe the global aspect is the new part of it. Originally this tag was implemented on Manhattan, so maybe the squid showers were limited to New York or the U.S., and now they're global. I'm not sure exactly what the message there is. But as with Lindelof, I'm sure it wasn't shown by accident. There's a reason why that was available to us as an audience member. But either way, we find ourselves at the scene of the crime in the next scene. Some more information and world building takes place here. First, we find out that Angela's kids are not just adopted, but they're actually the kids of her old partner who was killed on the White Knight, along with his wife. There was a particularly impactful moment, by the way, when Looking Glass starts to express some interest in Angela's part in the chief's death, being that he was hanging out at her house the same night. She calls him a cold motherfucker for thinking such a thing, and he says, "Then why am I crying under here?" Referring, to his mask. I don't know why, but that line just kind of struck me for whatever reason. We also realized that this conspiracy, which we already know is at hand, not because old man Will says so, by the way, but because the comic book is canon, right? The giant squid that was unleashed on Manhattan was a conspiracy cooked up by Ozymandias to stop the world's superpowers from unleashing all-out nuclear war. By the way, there's a funny sort of tie-in that I'm just realizing now. I didn't even put this in my notes, but when they're showing the American Hero story, and the newsy kid is trying to sell papers. He's referring to the War of the Worlds and the reading on the radio that led people to think that there was an alien invasion, even though it was a hoax. Now, that's kind of funny in itself, right? Because this alien invasion with the giant squid was, in fact, a hoax. That wasn't an alien invasion. That was a domestic thing. That was something that Ozymandias cooked up in a lab and made it look like an alien invasion to sort of unite all the superpowers of the world against the aliens instead of fighting each other, right? So kind of a clever tie-in with the War of the Worlds, another alien hoax, although that one was accidental. So anyway, these crazy conspiracy people who live on the fringe of society, they're actually right, but they're presented as crazy people just as they are in our world, right? In this episode, they're seen flying around in these self-propelled sort of moth suits and trying to capture footage of the crime scene, almost like paparazzi, yelling that the people deserve to know what's happening here. But they're almost shot out of the sky and dismissed as crazies, right? But back to Angela's story, we get a very meaningful flashback to the White Knight. Turns out, this coordinated attack on police officers that we first learned about in episode 1, it took place on Christmas. Well, technically Christmas Eve, but they waited until the stroke of midnight to kick down the door, so Christmas. She kills the first intruder, but the one who seemed to have come from upstairs ends up shooting her in the chest. Right before he finishes the job, she passes out and wakes up in a hospital bed with Judd sitting next to her. Now, at this point, she doesn't know him on a personal level because she calls him Captain. He then corrects her and says Judd. So this is like the first time they've met, on a personal level and not just this being her boss, right? Now he's all bandaged up too. The implication being that he was also attacked on the White Knight, although we can't know for sure because we didn't see it. And by the way, neither did Angela. So we can choose to believe him, or we can be skeptical. Given the story that old man Will is telling, it seems that skepticism is the right approach here, right? Angela is likely reevaluating these events in her head as well, but at any rate, this is the start of Judd and Angela's friendship, if you want to call it that, whether it was all part of a larger plan or something by Judd, who knows, but this is the start of them getting to know each other. The other thing to take note of here, how did Angela survive? So the last we saw, she was lying on the kitchen floor, already shot in the chest, and there's a shotgun pointed to her face. Now, to hear Judd tell the story, there was only one guy. He says, quote, "You got your guy too, stabbed him in the neck." So whatever happened to that second guy, there was clearly no body found at her home. Now, did Cal save her? Did Will save her, perhaps? I think we're assuming Will is hooded justice at this point, right? I mean, the colors of the outfit match, the ages line up. Maybe he saved his granddaughter, or maybe Judd was the second guy in the mask. Could that be possible? I'll say this. It seems like they only sent one guy to attack Judd, but apparently they sent two to attack Angela, which seems a little suspicious to me. I'd love to know who was under that second Rorschach mask, and if it's nobody important, then what happened to him? What allowed Angela to survive that event? Now, in the aftermath of the slaying of Judd, the police force shows up in Nixonville and plans on rounding everyone up. Due process, by the way, does not seem to apply here at all. It's just angry cops willing to throw their force around. One man throws a bottle, and Red Scare yells for the police to round everyone up violently, as it turns out. Now, it all seems way too obvious. Quite clearly, at least to me, it seems that whoever killed the police chief knew that this would be the result. The police would beat the hell out of the poor whites, and that would further the rift between the two parties. Oh, and we get some more insight into the Redfordations, too. Turns out President Redford introduced these Redfordations to make up for the victims of racial violence. Now, my guess is that they're nationwide and they apply to specific events. Now, in Tulsa, there are reparations available to victims from the Tulsa race riots of 1921, and only victims and descendants of victims are entitled to this money. So it's pretty strict. It's not just, every black person gets reparations for, racism and incidents of racial violence in the past. It's very specific to people who actually suffered through a specific event. And you need to prove that you are, in fact, someone who is entitled to this money by doing a DNA test. So that's all interesting. It felt very robotic. It didn't seem like, it almost seemed like a payoff. Like, yeah, I know we murdered your people, but here's some money. That's the vibe it had to it. It was cold. And it was all done in the background, too. This is basically just a way for Angela to test the DNA of Will to find out later, of course, that she is his granddaughter. But that's all this was. But we're seeing this sort of museum/reparation center, and it's all very strange. Hey, Angela's adopted son, by the way, Topher, he's in his room playing with something called Manhattan blocks. They're floating 3D magnetic block sets, and it seems that he's using them to build a sort of replica of Ozymandias' castle, just like Dr. Manhattan was doing with the sand on Mars. Why? How? I don't know yet. But it appears that basically Manhattan tech is still very much commercially available, and while some sectors of society have moved away from it for fear of causing cancer, that fear seems to have subsided for now, or it's like a small population or small segment of the population that still believes that these are carcinogens. Who knows? And hey, we got our first real look at American Hero Story. Everyone's watching it. It's the hottest show in town. Angela, Cal, and Topher, Looking Glass, the members of the cavalry who appear to be making some sort of suicide vest, by the way. Now, before the show even begins, the first detail is all the added notes of warning, right? They warn of sexual violence, language, all sorts of stuff that we get warned about at the beginning of a TV show, but also added warnings of racism, sexism, etc. So it appears that 30 years of a liberal president has had some effects on the content warnings, but the content itself is as violent as ever, right? Implying that there is almost like trigger warnings, but then there's an underlying thirst for violence and brutality. It shows to me that the cavalry's anger is only growing and that the whole thing is ready to explode. No pun intended, but also, I guess, pun intended. I also appreciated the Hooded Justice monologue from the show being laid over Angela driving to the wake. It helped tie in the theory that Will is Hooded Justice, again, a theory that I find to be 100% true, and of course, Angela is his granddaughter. I mean, what else could it be? Now, at the wake, we meet Joe Keane Jr. Of course, Joe Keane, as a reminder, is the guy who outlawed masked vigilantes way back in the late 70s, I want to say, early 80s, whenever it took place. His father's the one that did that, and then this is his son, clearly a right-wing guy, at least on the surface. Now, I would bet my life that he is somehow involved in this insidious conspiracy. At any rate, Angela fakes passing out so she can search the house, and she discovers a KKK outfit with a badge on it. Pretty sketchy there, Judd. I don't know how you explain that. When Angela returns to the bakery to confront old man Will about it, accusing him of planting the evidence, Will claims to know nothing about it. This is also where we find out that Angela is, in fact, Will's granddaughter. And just as she's hauling him to jail, an aircraft comes out of nowhere, picks up the car off the ground, using one of those giant, magnetic discs that you see at a dump, the ones that are used to crush cars into little metal cubes. And it flies off with Will. Definitely Hooded Justice. I was convinced. Now I'm more convinced that that's possible. And he's sort of smirking at Angela through the side mirror. Now I'm assuming the original Minutemen, at least some part of them, are still intact in some way, and that's how they managed to kill the chief together, or using some sort of technology or whatever. Finally, let's catch up with that creepy old fuck Ozymandias. We see one of the rehearsals of his twisted play, and we get some insight on what he's up to, although, to be fair, much of it's still a mystery. Turns out he has more than 2 assistants. He's got a bunch of them, and all the men look the same, and all the women look the same. This would lead one to believe that they're clones of some sort. He's having them play out the story of Dr. Manhattan and how the watchmaker's son came to be a superhuman. But he's actually burning one of those clones alive in an incinerator, basically showing a complete lack of apathy when it comes to these creatures. One is simply promoted to the new role to be burned alive the next time that they do the play. But why? That's the mystery here. It appears he is maybe training these clones for some purpose, but what's the reason? What's Ozymandias' plan here? Or, of course, there's the other theory, that this is simply Dr. Manhattan disguised as Ozymandias. They've introduced the idea that Dr. Manhattan can make himself look like a human, and then they've dismissed that idea just as quickly. That could be because it's not possible. That also could be because it is. That's exactly what's going on, and they're trying to throw us, the audience, off the scent. But we did also see in the newspaper from episode 1 that Ozymandias had died, right? So did he fake his own death, or was that the truth? It also seems like they didn't really know whether or not he was dead, but he'd been missing for so long that they finally pronounced him dead. So maybe that's just because he's been isolated working on this secret project. The point is he's clearly trying to create life, like a god, similar to what Dr. Manhattan is doing on Mars, or supposed to be doing on Mars. But the one thing worth noting is that these beings are completely oblivious in servitude. I mean, shit, the guy who had been taking the burnt corpses down to the basement over and over again just got promoted to be the next corpse next time they do the play, and he's all too happy to sort of have the honor. And for anyone thinking Ozymandias has just lost his mind, it's clear that he has a plan. When one of the clones asks him, quote, if it has stopped, in reference to the watch, he replies, it's only just begun, implying that his plan is just starting to be set into motion. That reminded me of an old creative writing assignment, by the way, that I had in high school. We had to write a short story, and the end had to have a misunderstood question similar to the one we just heard. I remember I wrote about someone who was going through difficult times, troubled times, and they were, in the kitchen washing dishes by themselves. The whole story was the person sort of lost in their thoughts and going through all the regrets they've had in their life that led them to be where they are today, all while sort of absentmindedly washing these dishes. Then at the end, a person comes in and says, do you need any help? To which the dishwasher replies, yes, but it's far too late for that now. Shout out to Mrs. Nordland. Great assignment. But anyway, yeah, that's where episode 2 leaves us. I'm planning on doing a mini episode later in the week where I dive deeper into PDpedia. For those unfamiliar, if you go to hbo.com/PDpedia, spelled PETEYPEDIA. There are a bunch of files uploaded that provide extra content and context for the Watchmen world. There's a file dump after each episode. So right now there are 2 folders, 7 total documents to look at. I'll be getting into that later, but that's it for today. So thank you for listening. I hope you continue to tune in and check out new episodes of the podcast and other offerings from The Disorderly. And quick shout out to Old Man Will, who is the funniest character in this show. He asks for sugar in his coffee, and when Angela says she doesn't have any, he says some bakery. And then at the end, he says that he would have been rescued because he has friends in high places. Well, as it turns out, he meant that literally, as he was later rescued by an aircraft that floated him away. Loved it. Can't wait to see more of that old man. And how about the final point where the flyer falls out of the sky yet again and lands in the hand of Angela, likely causing her to question the same thing that her great-grandfather pondered back in the First World War. That's that sort of circular, cyclical energy there. Damn, this show is good. This show is so good. I can't wait for next Sunday. Again, I'll be releasing an episode later in the week that sort of dives into the PDpedia stuff if you're interested in that. Otherwise, I'll be back next week with a new episode of this companion podcast. So thank you again for listening. Once again, we're presented by The Disorderly, the best in sports entertainment, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.